There's a lake in California where you can walk your dog safely, but if that dog stops to dig a hole in the dirt, it could suffocate in under a minute. There's no warning growl, no visible threat, nothing that looks remotely dangerous. Just pine trees, blue water, and a picnic-perfect shoreline. The lake is called Horseshoe Lake, and the ground around it is quietly leaking a gas that has already killed the forest surrounding it. Over 100 acres of trees, stone dead, standing in neat rows like skeletons at a party they never agreed to attend. That's unsettling on its own. But here's the thing you need to understand before we go any further. If you thought that lake was dangerous, wait until you see what's coming next. Because Horseshoe Lake isn't even close to the most alarming body of water in this country, and it's not even the only one in its own state. America has at least one seriously hazardous lake in every single state, and the reasons are never the same twice. Sometimes it's a supervolcano. Sometimes it's a collapsed salt mine. Sometimes it's just an ordinary lake with an extraordinary drowning statistic attached to it. We went state by state, alphabetically, and pulled out the one lake in each that locals treat with real respect. By the end, you'll never look at a peaceful lake view the same way again. Quick heads up before we dive in. This list covers all 50 states, so it's a lot to take in. If you make it to the end and you can still remember even one fact from this video, congratulations, you're officially a global genius. And if you want more videos like this one, go ahead and hit subscribe now so you don't miss the next deep dive. Drop a comment along the way with whichever state surprises you the most, and let's get into it. Alabama, Smith Lake. Smith Lake, northwest of Birmingham, is one of the clearest, deepest reservoirs in the South, and that combination is exactly what makes it risky. Some coves plunge past 300 feet, and the water column develops a sharp thermocline in summer, a shelf where warm surface water sits directly above water that's shockingly cold. Swimmers who dive down through that layer can be hit with sudden muscle cramps or panic, and the lake's numerous rocky coves and submerged trees add hazards for boaters navigating after dark or after a few drinks, which happens often on a lake this popular. Alaska, Lake Iliamna. Alaska's largest lake is also one of its most remote, a body of water so big it generates its own localized weather. Sudden squalls can turn the surface violent with almost no warning, and because the lake sits hours from the nearest hospital by float plane, a capsized boat here is a far more serious emergency than it would be almost anywhere else in the country. The water rarely climbs out of the 40s, so cold water immersion and hypothermia are the real threats. Local legend also tells of a lake monster called Illy, though the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has never confirmed anything scarier than the cold itself. Arizona, Lake Powell. Lake Powell is a labyrinth of narrow, glowing red rock canyons flooded by the Glen Canyon Dam, and its geography is part of the danger. Houseboats and jet skis share tight, blind canyon corners with no room to react, and the lake sees more boating fatalities than almost any other reservoir in the Southwest most years. Add scorching summer heat, alcohol-fueled houseboat parties, and a maximum depth of over 500 feet near the dam, and you have a lake where a moment of carelessness turns fatal fast. Arkansas, Bull Shoals Lake. Bull Shoals Lake sits in the Ozarks along a dam that generates hydropower, and its danger comes from something many visitors don't think about: sudden water releases. The Army Corps of Engineers can open the dam's generators with little warning, and downstream water levels can rise several feet in minutes, catching waders and anglers off guard along the White River. The lake itself is deep and cold, riddled with submerged bluffs and old flooded structures from before the reservoir was built. California, Horseshoe Lake. We already met this one. Horseshoe Lake sits on the southern flank of Mammoth Mountain, a volcano on the rim of the Long Valley caldera. After a 1989 earthquake swarm, magmatic carbon dioxide began seeping directly into the soil around the lake, and it hasn't stopped. Concentrations in the ground have been measured as high as 90% CO2 in spots, enough to kill over 100 acres of surrounding forest and, in 1990, nearly suffocate a forest ranger trapped in a snow-buried cabin. Camping in the tree kill zones is now banned for exactly that reason. Colorado, Lake San Cristobal. Colorado's second largest natural lake exists because of catastrophe. It formed around 700 years ago when the Slumgullion earthflow, a massive, still active landslide, slumped down a mountainside and dammed the lake fork of the Gunnison River. The remarkable part is that the earthflow never fully stopped moving. It continues to creep downhill today, meaning the same slow-motion process that created the lake could, in theory, keep reshaping the terrain around it. In the meantime, the lake's cold snowmelt water and quick-changing mountain weather make it a serious cold water hazard for boaters and swimmers. Connecticut, Candlewood Lake. Connecticut's largest lake is entirely artificial, built in the 1920s by flooding several valleys and farms to feed a hydroelectric pump storage system. That original purpose is still active, which means the Housatonic Company can raise or lower the lake's level on any given day, depending on power demand, sometimes leaving docks and shallow areas suddenly exposed or submerged. Combine fluctuating water levels with dense summer boat traffic on a lake with limited visibility, and you get a steady stream of collision and drowning incidents most warm weather seasons. Delaware, Indian River Bay / Rehoboth Bay area ponds. Delaware has almost no large natural lakes, so its most dangerous inland waters are the shallow coastal ponds and mill ponds feeding into Rehoboth and Indian River Bay. The real threat isn't depth, it's currents and tidal pull where these freshwater bodies interact with tidal inlets, along with sudden summer thunderstorms that sweep across the flat coastal plain with little warning. Swimmers who underestimate a small pond here are often caught by currents stronger than the calm surface suggests. Florida, Lake Okeechobee. Lake Okeechobee is enormous, shallow, and surrounded by the aging Herbert Hoover Dike, a 143-mile earthen levee that engineers have flagged for decades as a serious failure risk during major hurricanes. A dike breach here in 1928 killed an estimated 2,500 people, one of the deadliest natural disasters in U.S. history. Today, the lake also regularly develops toxic blue-green algae blooms severe enough to close beaches and threaten drinking water, on top of a healthy alligator population that makes casual swimming a bad idea to begin with. Georgia, Lake Lanier. Lake Lanier is one of the deadliest lakes in the country by raw numbers, averaging multiple boating and drowning fatalities almost every year. Part of the reason is what's underneath it. The lake was created in the 1950s by flooding the town of Oconee along with farms, roads, cemeteries, and a former racetrack. And much of that submerged infrastructure, foundations, bridge pilings, fence lines, is still down there, tangling swimmers and boat propellers alike. Add heavy weekend boat traffic and a lake known for sudden, violent thunderstorms, and the danger compounds fast. Hawaii, Green Lake. Until 2018, Green Lake on the Big Island was Hawaii's largest freshwater lake, a 200-foot deep crater pool locals called Kauai Apele. When Kilauea's lower east rift zone eruption sent lava toward the coast that June, the flow reached Green Lake at 10 in the morning. By early afternoon, the entire lake had boiled away. It no longer exists. If a lake can vanish in under 5 hours, Dangerous barely covers it. And it's a stark reminder that much of Hawaii's Big Island sits on some of the most active ground on the planet. Idaho, Redfish Lake. Redfish Lake, tucked into the Sawtooth Mountains, is stunning and startlingly deep, dropping past 300 feet not far from shore. That depth means the water stays close to freezing well into summer, even as the surface warms in the sun, creating the classic cold shock danger. Swimmers jump in expecting a pleasant alpine lake, and instead hit water cold enough to trigger involuntary gasping and muscle failure. Sudden mountain squalls can also whip up dangerous chop, with almost no warning on a lake ringed by peaks over 10,000 feet. Illinois, Lake Michigan, Chicago shoreline. Along Chicago's stretch of Lake Michigan, the danger isn't exotic geology, it's structural currents. Piers, breakwalls, and harbor jetties create powerful, localized rip currents that can pull swimmers away from shore within seconds. And Chicago's beaches see a troubling number of drownings most summers, disproportionately involving swimmers who didn't realize how quickly a calm-looking day could turn. Cold water shock is also a factor even in July, since Lake Michigan's deep water stays far colder than the sun-warmed shallows near the sand. Indiana Dunes National Park waters. The stretch of Lake Michigan bordering Indiana's dunes has become one of the deadliest freshwater swimming areas in the country, driven by the same rip current mechanics found elsewhere on the lake, but amplified by the dune's underwater sandbar structure. These bars trap water that then rushes back out to the lake through narrow channels, generating currents strong enough to overpower experienced swimmers. Lifeguards here specifically train for rescues tied to structural currents rather than storms, because on a sunny, calm day is exactly when most incidents happen. Iowa, West Okoboji Lake. West Okoboji is one of only 3 true blue water glacial lakes in the world, carved out by retreating ice sheets and dropping to around 130 feet in places, unusual depth for the Midwest. That depth creates a strong summer thermocline, and swimmers diving from boats or docks into the deceptively warm surface layer can suddenly hit frigid water below, triggering panic and cramping. The lake's clarity also tempts people to swim farther from shore than they realize, since visibility makes distances hard to judge. Kansas, Milford Lake. Milford Lake, the state's largest reservoir, sits in an area prone to sudden severe thunderstorms and even occasional tornadic activity. And its open, largely treeless surroundings offer little shelter for boaters caught off guard. Wind can build meaningful whitecaps across the lake's long exposed fetch in a short amount of time. Fluctuating water levels tied to flood control operations also periodically expose or submerge underwater hazards like old roadbeds and building foundations from before the reservoir was built. Kentucky, Lake Cumberland. Lake Cumberland is held back by Wolf Creek Dam, an earthen and concrete structure sitting on porous karst limestone riddled with underground caves and channels. In 1967, and again in 2005, seepage through that limestone foundation grew severe enough that engineers formally rated the dam a high risk for catastrophic failure, warning that a breach could send a wall of water toward Nashville within roughly a day and a half. A $594 million emergency repair, completed in 2013, finally stabilized it. But for the better part of a decade, one of the largest lakes east of the Mississippi sat behind a dam that genuinely might not have held. Louisiana, Lake Peigneur. On November 20th, 1980, a Texaco drilling crew accidentally punched through the roof of an inactive salt mine more than 1,000 feet beneath this shallow 10-foot lake near New Iberia. Fresh water poured into the mine, dissolving the salt pillars holding up its ceiling, and the entire lake drained into the collapsing mine within hours, swallowing a drilling platform, 11 barges, and about 65 acres of the surrounding island in a violent whirlpool. Every worker escaped, but the lake that exists today is a different lake entirely, over 200 feet deep and permanently saltwater, a direct product of one catastrophic drilling error. Maine, Sebago Lake. Sebago Lake, the primary water supply for Portland, is the second largest lake in Maine and one of the deepest in New England, dropping past 300 feet in its main basin. That depth keeps the water frigid year-round, and combined with sudden squalls that can sweep down off the surrounding hills, it's produced a steady history of drowning and capsizing incidents, particularly among boaters who underestimate how quickly conditions on open water can shift. Maryland, Deep Creek Lake. Deep Creek Lake in the Appalachian Highlands of far western Maryland freezes over in winter and draws heavy snowmobile and ice fishing traffic. But ice thickness can vary wildly across the lake depending on currents and inflow points, leading to a recurring pattern of vehicles and snowmobiles breaking through unexpectedly. In summer, the lake's popularity with jet skis and pontoon boats in a relatively narrow winding basin creates its own collision risk, especially around blind coves. Massachusetts, Quabbin Reservoir. The Quabbin Reservoir was created between 1938 and 1946 by deliberately flooding 4 entire towns, Enfield, Dana, Greenwich, and Prescott, to supply drinking water to Boston. Homes were demolished, cemeteries relocated, and residents forced out before the valley was allowed to fill. Swimming and most recreational boating are banned outright today, partly to protect the water supply, but the reservoir's history as a drowned landscape, complete with old roads and building foundations still resting on the bottom, makes any unauthorized entry into the water considerably riskier than it looks. Michigan, Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan doesn't need volcanic drama to be dangerous. Its scale alone, over 22,000 square miles, generates real waves and currents, especially along southern and eastern shorelines where sandbars and piers produce powerful rip currents that can pull even strong swimmers away from the beach in seconds. The lake also produces meteotsunamis, waves triggered by rapid air pressure shifts during storms rather than earthquakes, capable of sweeping people off piers on an otherwise sunny day. Lake Michigan frequently records more drowning deaths per year than any other Great Lake. Minnesota, Lake Superior. Lake Superior is cold enough even in summer to cause hypothermia in under 30 minutes for anyone stranded in the open water, and its size lets it generate genuine ocean-scale storms with waves that have sunk full-sized freighters, most famously the SS Edmund Fitzgerald in 1975, lost with all 29 crew during a November gale. Along Minnesota's North Shore, sudden squalls and rogue waves have also swept hikers and photographers off shoreline rocks with little warning, a hazard park rangers actively warn visitors about every season. Mississippi, Ross Barnett Reservoir. Ross Barnett Reservoir, just outside Jackson, is home to one of the densest concentrations of American alligators in the state, some well over 10 feet long, sharing the water with heavy recreational boat traffic. The lake's marshy backwaters and cypress-lined coves reduce visibility and make it easy to misjudge both depth and what might be swimming nearby, a combination that keeps local wildlife officials issuing regular alligator safety reminders to swimmers and waders. Missouri, Lake of the Ozarks. Lake of the Ozarks is notorious nationally for its party culture, and the danger follows directly from that reputation. Its main channel, known locally as the Banyell Dam Strip and Party Cove, sees dense weekend boat traffic combined with heavy alcohol consumption, a mix that produces a steady toll of boating collisions and drownings most seasons. The lake's winding 1,150-mile shoreline also creates countless blind coves where boats meet unexpectedly at speed. Montana, Quake Lake. Quake Lake didn't exist before August 17, 1959. That night, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake near Hebgen Lake triggered the largest seismically induced landslide ever recorded in North America, an 80-million-ton wall of rock that thundered down at highway speeds, buried a full campground, and dammed the Madison River in under a minute. 28 people died, most of them vacationing campers, and 19 bodies were never recovered, still resting beneath the slide. The lake that formed behind that new natural dam is the lake that exists today, a direct monument to how fast a peaceful mountain valley can turn lethal. Nebraska, Lake Maconochie. Lake Maconochie, Nebraska's largest reservoir, is fed and drained by an active irrigation system, which means underwater currents near the dam's outlet structures can be strong and largely invisible from the surface. Its long, exposed profile across the flat plains also makes it vulnerable to fast-building wind and lightning, a serious concern given how far open water it offers, with essentially no natural shelter for boaters. Nevada, Lake Mead. Since a decades-long mega-drought began pulling Lake Mead down to record low levels, the reservoir's retreating shoreline has revealed a grim string of discoveries. In 2022 alone, authorities recovered 4 sets of human remains within a few months, including a body found stuffed in a barrel that had likely been submerged since the 1970s or 80s. Beyond the human history it's giving up, low water has also exposed sunken boats and old intake structures, and drowning has consistently been the leading cause of death recorded at the park. New Hampshire, Lake Winnipesaukee. New Hampshire's largest lake stays remarkably cold well into summer thanks to its glacial depth, and its 274 miles of island-studded shoreline hide countless submerged rock ledges just beneath the surface, a serious hazard for boaters running at speed in unfamiliar coves. Sudden mountain-driven squalls can also build whitecaps across the open basin faster than the forecast usually predicts. New Jersey, Lake Hopatcong. New Jersey's largest lake is heavily developed with private docks, marinas, and dense summer boat traffic squeezed into a relatively narrow, winding body of water, a combination that produces frequent collisions between watercraft. Underwater hazards near older, partially collapsed dock structures and shallow rocky shoals add further risk for anyone unfamiliar with the lake's layout. New Mexico Elephant Butte Lake. Elephant Butte, New Mexico's largest lake, sits in a desert basin prone to sudden, violent monsoon thunderstorms that can trigger flash flooding through the canyons, feeding into it with almost no warning. Water levels here also fluctuate dramatically with drought and irrigation demand, at times dropping the lake to a small fraction of its normal size and exposing hazards, and at other times refilling fast enough to catch boaters and campers on newly submerged banks off guard. New York, Green Lake. Green Lake in Green Lake State Park near Syracuse is a meromictic lake, meaning its water forms two layers that never mix, a structure created by the narrow, steep-walled sinkhole it formed in roughly 13,000 years ago. Its bottom layer has been cut off from the surface for millennia, and in that time it's accumulated dissolved hydrogen sulfide, methane, and carbon dioxide from thousands of years of decomposing organic matter. Lakes with this exact structure have released their trapped gases catastrophically elsewhere in the world. Green Lake's risk is considered low, but it isn't zero. A bottle that stayed corked for 10,000 years with no guarantee it stays that way. North Carolina Lake Norman. Lake Norman, North Carolina's largest man-made lake, sits next to the McGuire Nuclear Station, which discharges warm water back into part of the lake, drawing swimmers to that section even in cooler months, sometimes without realizing how quickly conditions can change near the discharge zone. The lake's heavy boat traffic on a long, narrow reservoir with countless coves also makes it one of the state's busiest sites for boating accidents, and it sits near the northern edge of American Alligator's expanding range. North Dakota Devil's Lake. Devil's Lake is a closed basin with no natural outlet, which means the only way water leaves is through evaporation. And starting in 1993, it simply stopped evaporating fast enough. Over the following 2 decades, the lake more than tripled in size, rising over 25 feet and swallowing more than 100,000 acres of farmland, homes, roads, and cemeteries. Communities have spent well over $1 billion on levees and emergency outlets just to keep the rising water from consuming the city itself. A lake that's dangerous not because of what's underneath it, but because it simply won't stop growing. Ohio, Lake Erie. Lake Erie is the shallowest of the Great Lakes, which means its relatively small volume of water heats up fast and whips into dangerous, steep waves far more quickly than its deeper siblings during storms. It's also become a hotspot for toxic algae blooms fed by agricultural runoff. And in August 2014, one bloom released enough microcystin toxin to shut off drinking water for roughly 500,000 people in the Toledo area for 2 days, a public health emergency triggered entirely by the lake itself. Oklahoma, Lake Texoma. Lake Texoma, straddling the Oklahoma-Texas border, is known for strong currents generated by its 2 feeding rivers, the Red and the Washita. Currents that don't disappear just because the water looks calm on the surface. The lake also has a documented history of exposure to naturally occurring toxins tied to certain algae blooms in warm months, and its size and open exposure make it prone to fast-forming storms that catch boaters far from shore. Oregon, Crater Lake. Crater Lake is the deepest lake in the United States, plunging to nearly 1,950 feet inside a caldera left behind when the volcano Mount Mazama collapsed roughly 7,700 years ago. Its extraordinary depth keeps the water dangerously cold year-round, and the caldera's steep, often unstable walls make emergency access difficult if someone gets into trouble in the water. Mazama is still considered part of the active Cascade volcanic arc, dormant rather than extinct, sitting quietly beneath one of the most photographed lakes in the country. Pennsylvania, Lake Erie shoreline, Presque Isle. Along Pennsylvania's short stretch of Lake Erie shoreline, Presque Isle State Park has recorded a disproportionate number of drownings tied to structural rip currents generated by the peninsula's sandbars. similar to the mechanism seen along Indiana's dunes. Warning flags and lifeguard patrols were expanded here specifically because of how often calm-looking days turn into multi-victim rescue situations. Rhode Island Scituate Reservoir. Scituate Reservoir supplies drinking water to most of Rhode Island, and public access is deliberately restricted to protect that supply, which itself signals the seriousness with which the state treats the water. Unauthorized swimming is banned, and the reservoir's steep, wooded shoreline combined with cold, deep water makes any unofficial entry considerably more dangerous than the placid surface suggests. South Carolina, Lake Jockasee. Lake Jockasee is famous among scuba divers for something eerie: an entire flooded town and orchard sitting beneath more than 300 feet of remarkably clear, cold water. That combination, extreme depth, near freezing temperatures at the bottom, and submerged structures divers can get disoriented inside, has made Jockasee the site of multiple technical diving fatalities over the years, drawing experienced divers specifically because of the danger and occasionally not returning them. South Dakota Lake Oahe. Lake Oahe, a massive Missouri River reservoir, is known for strong currents near its dam, particularly during high-release periods when the Army Corps of Engineers adjusts flow for flood control or power generation. Its long, exposed profile across open prairie also leaves boaters vulnerable to fast-building wind, and its cold depths add serious hypothermia risk for anyone who ends up in the water unexpectedly. Tennessee Reelfoot Lake. Reelfoot Lake exists because of the New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812, a series of quakes so powerful that sections of the Mississippi River briefly reversed course. The shaking caused land in northwest Tennessee to subside, and floodwaters rushed in to drown an entire cypress forest, whose ancient trunks still rise eerily out of the lake today. The New Madrid seismic zone that created it is still active, and seismologists warn that a repeat of an 1811 scale event, striking today's far more developed region, could be catastrophic, in a way the sparse frontier of 1811 never experienced. Texas Caddo Lake. Caddo Lake, straddling the Texas-Louisiana border, is a maze of bald cypress and Spanish moss, home to one of the densest alligator populations in Texas. Some recorded well over 12 feet long. Its swampy structure adds its own layer of risk. Thick vegetation and shallow channels that suddenly drop off make depth and current easy to misjudge in the tea-colored water. And venomous cottonmouth snakes are common throughout the surrounding wetlands. Utah Great Salt Lake. The Great Salt Lake has never been swimmable in a traditional sense, but its modern danger comes from disappearing. Decades of upstream water diversion and drought have shrunk it to a fraction of its historical size, exposing a lakebed loaded with naturally occurring and industrially deposited heavy metals, including arsenic. When wind sweeps across that newly exposed playa, it kicks up fine toxic dust and sends it drifting directly into the Salt Lake City metro area, home to well over 1 million people, a slow-motion public health threat rather than a single dramatic event. Vermont, Lake Champlain. Lake Champlain is deep, cold, and prone to sudden, violent squalls that sweep down off the Adirondacks and Green Mountains with little warning, catching sailors and kayakers in open water far from shelter. It's also home to Vermont's own lake monster legend, Champ, though the real hazard here is entirely mundane: cold water immersion and fast-shifting weather on a lake large enough to feel like open water. Virginia, Lake Anna. Lake Anna is split into a hot side and a cold side by its proximity to the North Anna Nuclear Generating Station, which discharges warmed water into part of the lake year-round. That warm water has been linked to the presence of Neglaria fowleri, a rare but often fatal amoeba that thrives in warm freshwater, and Virginia health officials have documented cases tied to warm water lake exposure in the state. Combine that with the lake's heavy recreational boat traffic, and Lake Anna carries risks most reservoirs simply don't have to think about. Washington, Spirit Lake. When Mount St. Helens erupted on May 18, 1980, the resulting landslide, the largest in recorded history, slammed directly into Spirit Lake, raising its water level by roughly 200 feet and covering its surface with a floating raft of thousands of dead trees still visible today. The bigger ongoing danger is structural. The debris dam now holding back the lake's water has been flagged by engineers as a genuine failure risk, serious enough that the Army Corps built a tunnel through solid rock specifically to drain excess water and manage the pressure. West Virginia, Summersville Lake. Summersville Lake, West Virginia's largest lake, is known for exceptionally clear, deep water that draws scuba divers, but that same clarity and depth create classic cold water hazards, sudden thermoclines that shock swimmers diving from the surface, along with steep underwater cliffs near old quarry areas that have proven fatal for divers pushing past their limits. Wisconsin, Devil's Lake. Wisconsin's Devil's Lake sits inside a gorge carved by ancient glacial meltwater and ringed by 500-foot quartzite bluffs, popular with both swimmers and rock climbers. The lake has no natural inlet or outlet, and its steep talus slope shoreline drops off quickly into deep, cold water just a short distance from the beach, a combination that's led to a steady number of drowning incidents among swimmers who underestimate how fast the bottom disappears. Wyoming, Yellowstone Lake. And that brings us to the one that outclasses every other entry on this list by an almost absurd margin. Yellowstone Lake sits inside an active volcanic caldera that erupted with almost inconceivable force roughly 631,000 years ago. And the magma chamber beneath it never went anywhere. Still enormous, still just a few miles beneath the surface, still heating everything above it. Scientists have mapped hundreds of hydrothermal vents across the lake bed, actively venting scalding water every day. The real immediate risk isn't a supervolcano eruption. It's a hydrothermal explosion, superheated water flashing instantly into steam and expanding over 1,000 times its original volume. Researchers have found the crater from exactly this kind of event at Mary Bay, over a mile wide, formed around 13,000 years ago, when an explosion many times more powerful than a large underground nuclear detonation tore open the lake floor. The USGS continues to monitor spots on the lakebed that are visibly bulging upward as pressure builds beneath them, but with no reliable way to predict exactly when or where the next explosion happens, only that the mechanism behind it is fully intact. The pattern underneath all of this. Here's what should stick with you after going through all 50 of these. Almost every one of these lakes is, by every visible measure, beautiful. That's not a coincidence. Volcanic and tectonic activity tends to produce dramatic, scenic landscapes, sharp mountains, mineral-rich water, unusual colors, striking topography, and those same forces are frequently what makes a place dangerous. Beauty and hazard aren't opposites in these places. They're often the exact same underlying cause, just viewed from two different angles. None of this means you should avoid these lakes. Millions of people visit Yellowstone every year and leave with nothing more dramatic than a great photo. Families picnic at Green Lake State Park, constantly without incident. The overwhelming majority of visits to every lake on this list end exactly the way you'd expect, peacefully. But the next time you're standing at the edge of a lake that looks just a little too perfect, remember that some of the most dangerous places in this country don't look dangerous at all. They look like the nicest spot for a picnic you've ever seen. And that's exactly the point.